Hello, welcome to Lesson 9. In the previous lecture, we began our study of the 20th and 21st centuries. As we continue on and continue to look at these much more recent writers, we're going to study, a literary movement that started in the mid 20th century when decolonization began following World War II. But it didn't really go into full swing until the 80s and the 90s, and then really the last 15 years, we've seen a lot of what we call post-colonial writing appear. And so we're going to start by looking at the section from the textbook called Nation, Race, and Language. And this section is what's important to take away from the title of this section is how important language is to both the colonial and post-colonial experiences of the former subjects of the British Empire. As we go through this lesson, we're going to look at 5 different authors from India, Nigeria, the Caribbean, Ireland, and Canada, respectively, to try to give you some breadth of post-colonial literature and what it looks like. Beginning with the background on decolonization and the importance of language to that experience. So as we've talked about multiple times before, the British Empire at its height, which rapid expansion, the empire expanded over a number of centuries, but rapid expansion began in 1870 in the latter part of the Victorian period and just continued to ramp up until World War II. And so through that time of really rapid expansion, the British Empire covered a quarter of the world. The sun never set on the British Empire, is the saying. So what we're noting here, though, is with that huge area covered by the British Empire, the language, English, of the British Empire displaced or commingled with indigenous languages. So if you think back to Macaulay's Minute on India speech, where he talked about creating a population of people who were Indian in blood and color, but English in every other attribute. That's the displacement, where you would have people in the colonies, native inhabitants in the colonies, being taught to speak English rather than their native language. You also have the commingling, because you had, even if they didn't, in certain instances where they didn't necessarily try to replace the native language, you had British people living there for decades. And so the commingling of the languages. All this is to say that what we're really studying here is how English language became a language of all of these colonies. A little bit more into the background here of decolonization. So the 20th century really witnessed a decolonization and de-evolution of the British Empire. The British Empire as an empire no longer really exists. Following that, as we mentioned before, I think in the previous lecture, it was World War II, and the expending of resources in World War II made it impossible to continue to maintain an empire that size. And the sheer size of it, I think, is evidence that it would have collapsed at some point. You just can't maintain an empire that large. It's not viable. But following World War II and following decolonization, large numbers of non-white immigrants arrived in England, and they were stigmatized, discriminated against. They were not treated well. What happened is there was 2 contradictory acts passed by Parliament following World War II and following the decolonization of India, the freedom of India in 1947. The 1948 British Nationality Act was passed, which just basically said if you were a citizen of a former British colony and you moved to England, you would be given British citizenship. And so England was this dream England of Shakespeare. In the Salman Rushdie reading, he talks about dream England. In other words, It's kind of like what I think today, as an analogy, many people think of America before they get there. This land, this dream land of opportunities. Um, but when they arrived, they were not treated well, as these bullet points show. And so it was contradictory in that sense. Um, Legally, they were welcomed into the country. Practically, that's not what happened. That's not how English people treated them when they arrived. And there was just this massive influx of immigrants. So many people moved to England from the former colonies when this Nationality Act was passed. About 10 years later, the exact date is in your textbook, another act was passed that limited um, immigration and set some different restrictions into place to slow down the steady flow of immigrants. And so there's a lot of poetry, a lot of fiction, a lot of scholarship, philosophy written responding to this. Um, I think one of the poems in the anthology is called England is a Bitch. And so there was a really, strong pushback against this. And you ultimately have numerous writings produced that um, push back on this British response, engage with it, challenge it, including the post-colonial writings we're reading, as well as what I would call not necessarily post-colonial literature, but multicultural British literature. Because of these transitions we're talking about here, Britain and London in particular are some of the most diverse areas in the world. And so there's a lot of literature that doesn't take place in the former colonies, but takes place in London or in England and deals with the multicultural population that's a result there as a result of colonization. One of the authors from Lesson 10, Zadie Smith, deals with that in her prize winning book, White Teeth. This issue goes back even farther, though. For instance, Gaelic was outlawed in Ireland. So we talked about how Ireland was treated as a colony basically for a long time. In the last lecture, we really covered, with Yeats and Joyce, we really covered the history of Britain and Ireland. But as an example, the first bullet point here, Gaelic was outlawed in Ireland, so the Irish were forced to speak English as well. Some other examples of how the languages displaced or commingled with each other. African and Caribbean school children were taught to write English and taught to write um, English style poetry. So you'd have African and Caribbean school children um, trying to write sonnets about lilacs in England that they had never seen. And that just shows, the ridiculous extent of this. They were not even writing about subject matter in their home where they were living. They'd never been to England and they were writing about it. There's a really great piece by Jamaica Kincaid, um, a post-colonial writer from the Caribbean, called On Seeing England for the First Time. And that really deals with kind of the difference between the imagined England and the real England that was the contrast that many children growing up in a post-colonial environment witnessed, was this kind of dream England that they were taught about, and then actual England, which was very harsh and unreceptive to non-white people. Um, One of the points the textbook makes is that English language and literature alienates colonized people from their distinctive cultural histories. So this goes back to the idea of displacement of the indigenous language. They're also distancing people from their culture and their cultural history. And this is one of the goals of empire. Um, some authors, like Kipling or even Conrad, might try to cast it in a positive light in poems like The White Man's Burden. Um, but in something like The Man Who Would Be King, we see and in the works we're about to look at, we see the horrible repercussions of it in a loss of native culture, certainly one of the tragedies of it. And so the final point here that's going to be a segue to talking about Rushdie is that he and other writers like him reject the assumption that English is tied to only one nation or race. So, in other words, because of the commingling with indigenous languages that happened throughout the history of the British Empire, English is no longer just English. It's now tied to the history and the culture of dozens of countries and cultures throughout the world. And those writers from those um, non-white countries have a claim to English, just as much of a claim as the English born in England do. So we're going to look at a number of writers, 5 to be exact. We're looking at 2 in this first section of the lecture, because I've paired together Salman Rushdie and Chinua Achebe for 2 reasons. They're probably the 2 most well-known, most influential post-colonial writers. They're also, both of their works we're reading are short, and then from Rushdie, we're just looking at his prose, his criticism, if you will. Although the textbook does include one of his short stories, I personally don't think it's the strongest story. The claims he makes in these prose pieces are incredibly important, and they serve really good context and background for looking at the remaining post-colonial writers. So Rushdie is definitely the most influential writer from India, and one of the most, if not the most influential post-colonial writers. But we're going to look at his prose as a backdrop to setting up our analyses of the remaining post-colonial writers we look at. So he published many novels and has won the Booker Prize at least twice, I think. 2 of his novels, Midnight's Children and The Satanic Verses, are 2 of the best novels ever written, I would say, but definitely 2 of the best post-colonial novels. And so you should definitely read them at some point, and hopefully you will in your academic career. But Imaginary Homelands was published in 1991, and it's a collection of essays he wrote between 81 and 91. I think Midnight's Children was published in 80, and The Satanic Verses in 87. And so, like I said, these um, essays from Imaginary Homelands, and the title really just says it all. What is home for the post-colonial writer? That's the question. Does it even exist? These essays from Imaginary Homelands really have, like I was saying earlier, some of the foundational statements for interpreting and understanding post-colonial literature. So there's 2 essays, excerpts from 2 essays from Imaginary Homelands in the textbook. So we're going to take a look at each of those and some of the best quotes from them, and pull apart those quotes and see what Rushdie is saying. And then as we go on and we study the other 4 post-colonial writers, we'll look and see how these foundational statements from Rushdie inform or embody the things going on in the pieces of literature. Rushdie says, our identity is at once plural and partial. Sometimes we feel that we straddle 2 cultures, at other times that we fall between 2 stools. But however ambiguous and shifting this ground may be, it is not an infertile territory for a writer to occupy. If literature is in part the business of finding new angles at which to enter reality, then once again our distance, our long geographical perspective, may provide us with such angles, or it may be that is simply what we must think in order to do our work. So Rushdie identifies the unique space that the post-colonial writer occupies. Post-colonial writing can provide a new perspective. After thousands of years of literature, you have this somewhat unique situation where you have individuals like Rushdie who are caught between 2 cultures, caught between 2 worlds. The world of their home, so to speak, and then the country that's colonized them, in this case, England. But for someone like Rushdie, both England and India are home. And so the literature he's able to produce from that perspective is quite amazing. There's also the idea here that I think is really essential to understanding post-colonial literature, which is that in trying to live and walk through decolonization, it's not like the empire simply pulls out and everything goes back to the way it was beforehand. You can't return. You can't go home, so to speak, because the changes wrought by colonization have lasting effects. And so there's not a pre-colonization way of life, an Eden, if you will, to which one can simply return. And so that's part of what makes the post-colonial condition such a dynamic and complicated one. But through this, we have, this, like I mentioned before, this uniquely fertile territory, so that writers can provide this unique perspective. I absolutely love the part of the quote that if literature is in part the business of finding new angles at which to enter reality, literature being the business of finding new angles at which to enter reality, I think that's one of the best quotes I've heard to encapsulate what literature does and why we study it. So suffice to say, the post-colonial condition provides some very new angles. And I would argue that post-colonial literature has produced some of the best pieces of writing from the last 50 years, some of the best pieces of writing ever. And so if you have not had the opportunity to immerse yourself in post-colonial literature, I hope you'll have a desire to after this class, and you most definitely should. Moving on to the second piece, which is called English is an Indian Literary Language. This really connects back to the title for this section, the importance of language to the colonial and post-colonial experiences. He argues that English is by now the world language. In other words, there's no other language that's spoken as widely or has as much influence. In part because the British Empire colonized so many parts of the world, it's just everywhere. And then US preeminence, which is kind of a separate thing, but so many countries interact with the US that English is just the most widely spoken and influential language. There's no way around it. And this is a subject for another day, as Rushdie says, but an important one nonetheless. The U.S. preeminence, the far-reaching influence we see of the U.S. now, that that could almost be perceived, or perhaps is, a new instance of colonialism and imperialism. So that would be something really interesting to explore in the latter units of an American literature class. What seems to be happening is that these peoples who were once colonized by the language are now rapidly remaking it, domesticating it, becoming more and more relaxed about the way they use it, assisted by the English language's enormous flexibility and size. They are carving out large territories for themselves within its frontier. So earlier we mentioned how the English are no longer the only ones with a claim to the English language, is one of Rushdy's views. So what you have is you have people from the former colonies, authors like Rushdie in particular, making their own claims to English, as he says, remaking it, domesticating it, carving out large territories for themselves within its frontiers. And the English language's enormous flexibility and size lends itself to it. So it's kind of a circumstance that worked out well. But the English language has always been malleable, fluid, influenced by multiple cultures and other languages. When it first emerged a little over a century ago in Anglo-Saxon culture, which you'll know if you've taken the first British literature survey, it was, had Latin influences as well as influences from several um, Germanic languages. So you end up with this language that has always been influenced by multiple cultures and is always changing. So, I mean, this just fits right in. It's right there. We use new words all the time. And you think of things like Urban Dictionary. We use new words all the time that seem like slang, but after a number of years become part of the English language. It's uniquely designed, you could say, to be influenced by writers like Rushdie and Achebe. And so you have these post-colonial writers giving their own spin, their own take on English, kind of reclaiming it, if you will, as kind of a reverse colonization. You know, 150 years ago, you have Thomas Babington Macaulay wanting to basically assimilate Indian people and make them more English. Now, after years of attempts to do that on the part of the British Empire, you have Indian writers like Rushdie writing back, and if you will, reverse colonizing the language, taking it and putting an Indian influence on it and making it their own, which I think is so cool. And we're going to look at how an African writer, specifically from Nigeria, Chinua Achebe, does that in just a few minutes. I want to give you one last Rushdie quote here before we transition, though. This is his response to efforts in India by the government in India to have like a national language. One of the most absurd aspects of this quest for national authenticity is that, as far as India is concerned anyway, it is completely fallacious to suppose that there is such a thing as a pure, unalloyed tradition from which to draw. So, in other words, India can never divorce itself from the colonial experience, and it's forever changed. Like I said earlier, there's no ability to return to a pure time or pure culture pre-colonization. The colonization will forever complicate everything Indian, and I think Rusty's extrapolating out here and generalizing a bit um, for any country that's a former colony of the British Empire. And so this is what we'll keep in mind as we go forward and look at the other four writers. We'll see, how do they deal with this? How do they deal with the inability to return to a time pre-colonization? How do they now, going forward, um, reclaim parts of their culture or their language while interacting with the English influences, um, and the power of literature to do that? So let's take a look at the first one here, Chinua Achebe. All right, so as it says here, Achebe is the most celebrated African novelist, and he really is for a number of well-earned reasons that we'll see in a second. His work transformed the landscape of African fiction, both at home and abroad. And so his works were so important following decolonization, how he strove to change public perception of Africans and how that changed how people throughout the world viewed people from Africa, as well as how his own people from Nigeria and other African countries, how they came to understand their own identities following post-colonial decolonization, following colonial experience. So influential in that regard. He refused to sentimentalize the people of Nigeria, so he challenged many stereotypes, which we're going to continue to look at this. In his works, he represented Africans in a very humanized way as full-fledged, complicated, complex, even flawed characters. Um, his African characters are never one note, and so that really challenges these stereotypes and perceptions that existed for years. One thing that's really important to note is during the years of colonization, as England was colonizing India and parts of Africa and the Caribbean and other places, one of the most lasting detrimental facts of that experience is that the English were the ones characterizing people from India and Africa and the Caribbean to the rest of the world. And so you had, you know, basically the observations and opinions of outsiders is the only things defining the representation of these groups of people to the rest of the world. And there's an important post-colonial scholar named Edward Said who coined the term Orientalism. And the term Orientalism is basically a big term to refer to everyone from the Eastern world, from former British colonies. And it's a term that indicates a false reality, that the reality people knew before decolonization, before the emergence of post-colonial literature, was one-sided, one-note, monolithical. It did not represent people from India and Africa and the Caribbean as people. It represented them as caricatures, as stereotypes, made a lot of assumptions about them, both positive and negative, but negative by dint of the fact that they were assumptions or stereotypes. And so we all know that people are complex individuals. And so Achebe's work and the work of many post-colonial writers, but Achebe was a trailblazer. He was really the first one, paved the way for better, more thorough, more nuanced representations of Africans and people from other post-colonial countries that would start to finally, through the power of literature, change the way people are viewed. Achebe was, forgive me for some of these pronunciations, but I believe Achebe was born in Agidi, an Igbo-speaking town, and educated in English at church schools. So one example of how, the English language was taught where these writers grew up, even though they were not growing up in England. He had a lot of achievements. He was the director of the Nigerian Broadcasting Company, and he taught at various universities in the U.S. for years. He's best known for his novels. His first novel, Things Fall Apart, was published in 1958. It's a short novel, and the Norton Anthology used to include the full text of it, and I wish they still did, although we do have a great short story here. But this was really the most influential one. It gives an insider's perspective on colonization. It shows the man, the leader of a family, Okonkwo is his name, in a small Nigerian town or village. And it shows a little bit of what his life is like before colonization. And then the British arrive, and you see, right as colonization is happening, you see the changes wrought on this community. And so it's a very, very poignant novel. The British asserted authority over Igbo in Nigeria through trade, religion, politics, and military. The novel shows this. It shows the destruction of an individual, his family, his culture at the start of colonization, like I said, right as it's happening. So this novel was incredibly powerful. Some might argue that Joyce's Ulysses is the best novel of the 20th century, and it's certainly influential. I think it would be hard to argue that anything is a more influential novel from the 20th century than Things Fall Apart, for all it did to change the perception of colonized peoples and what life was like in the colonies. And you see, the title is that line from Yeats's poem we just studied in the last lesson, The Second Coming. So the title shows how things just fall apart once the coloners arrive, how colonization and the chaos of it is some of the chaos of the modern world. But also, again, right away, we have an instance of what Rushdie was saying about language. By taking a quote from a Yeats poem, Achebe is putting his stamp on the English language, already remaking the English language in his post-colonial image, recolonizing Yeats, if you will. So that's quite an important move. Some of his other novels are No Longer at Ease, Arrow of God, and A Man of the People, and these were all written in the 60s, right after, just a few years after Things Fall Apart. And you really see, they don't necessarily have the same characters, but you see a progression here. Arrow of God, in particular, is probably the strongest one after Things Fall Apart, and you see further along in the colonial process what happens. His goal was to help his society regain belief in itself and put away years of denigration. So the challenging of stereotypes by depicting complex characters, that was an overt goal that he stated. He wanted to change the reputation, the assumptions about Africans throughout the world, particularly the Western world. He wanted to reverse the effects of colonization, you could say, through writing. And he really made significant strides in that regard and inspired other writers in that regard. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a look at the actual story included in our book by Achebe, Civil Peace. He wrote it right after the Nigerian Civil War, and it represents a society coming out of the continent. That's what it should say, their first major post-independent civil conflict. So things were often very messy after decolonization or through the process of decolonization. And there were lots of civil wars and interior struggles in decolonized countries. And the Nigerian Civil War was the first major one of those types of conflicts in a country after the British pulled out. And so you're seeing the aftermath here of the Nigerian Civil War in this story, but you're really also at the same time seeing the aftermath of colonization. The link between colonization and the Civil War is not necessarily a direct one, but it's one, if you study a little bit of history, I think you can suss out and see that you have another country basically running the government, controlling everything happening in a country, and all of a sudden they just leave. It's not, like I said, it's not like everything goes back to normal. It's not like the inhabitants of the country are just ready to take over all of that themselves. There's no infrastructure. There's not really a government in place, so there's often chaos. And so the Nigerian Civil War was awful. If you just look up, the textbook doesn't talk too much about it, but if you just Google it, look it up on Wikipedia, you'll see it was incredibly violent. Some even considered what happened a genocide. And Britain actually funded one of the sides in the war, so they still had their hands in it, even though Nigeria gained its independence from England in 1960. So it was decolonization is a complicated, messy affair that often leads to more violence. The violence doesn't just end with the end of colonization, and so Achebe gets at that here in his story. So let's see how he depicts that. One of the quotes I really like here from the start of this story, and really the focus here is the protagonist, Jonathan. The way the story depicts Jonathan is key to challenging colonial rhetoric. He had come out of the war with 5 inestimable blessings: his head, his wife Maria's head, and the heads of 3 out of their 4 children. As a bonus, he also had his old bicycle, a miracle too, but naturally not to be compared to the safety of 5 human heads. So, despite losing a child in the war, Jonathan benevolently welcomes the blessings of survival. He humbly affirms life. Jonathan Agwabu here is just a guy who's always optimistic, always positive, and really grateful is the word I would use to describe him. And that makes him such a powerful character. He's lost one of his children in the war. And so to many of us, we see this as a tragedy. But what Achebe does here that's brilliant and beautiful is he takes a character who looks at a situation and finds gratitude no matter what. So he's got 3 children and his wife who are all still alive. Many people lost their entire family in this war, and so he has much for which to be grateful, and he finds gratitude in that rather than being consumed by tragedy. So this is an important part of his character that Achebe establishes early. Moving along, let's talk a little bit more about the bicycle. It wasn't his disreputable rags. This is describing the person trying to take his bicycle during the war. It wasn't his disreputable rags, nor the toes peeping out of one blue and one brown canvas shoe, nor yet the 2 stars of his rank done obviously in a hurry in biro, that troubled Jonathan. Many good and heroic soldiers looked the same or worse. It was rather a certain lack of grip and firmness in his manner. So Jonathan, suspecting he might be amenable to influence, rummaged in his raffia bag and produced the 2 pounds which he had been going to buy firewood, which his wife Maria retailed to camp officials for extra stockfish and cornmeal, and got his bicycle back. That night he buried it in a little clearing in the bush, where the dead of the camp, including his own youngest son, were buried. When he dug it up again a year later after the surrender, all it needed was a little palm oil greasing. Nothing puzzles God, he said in wonder. So you have him interacting with a soldier who wants to take his bicycle in this kind of flashback to the time of the war. And he's able to size this guy up. He sees that he's not the most confident guy, and so he's able to just bribe him a little bit, not have to give up that much to keep his bicycle. And then he keeps it safe next to by banging it next to his son. So that shows the importance of the significance of the bicycle. He keeps things in perspective, like the quote on the last slide showed. He never values the bicycle more than any of his children, but it is important, and we'll see why soon. And so it's significant he buries it there. But the bicycle, like his children, is a blessing, and so nothing puzzles God. This is important. This phrase is mentioned over and over again in the story, and so it's basically a phrase that means Jonathan understands there's something greater than himself, God, in that God is in control of things. God has a wisdom perhaps beyond human wisdom, and Jonathan is able to put his faith in that, and that helps him survive because he's able to really appreciate everything, to really be grateful for everything he does have. And so this phrase, nothing puzzles God, comes up over and over again to emphasize that. Jonathan then uses the bicycle and is able to make a little business and make a profit. And he saw that, he knew that. So he's able to assess people and opportunities well. And that's why, while the bicycle wasn't as important as his family, it was still important. And one day he makes a fair amount of money and is very careful about it not having it stolen. But that night at his home, people come and try to rob his home. And you have this incident that follows that's really the most important part of the story. His family are crying for help as the robbers are pounding on the door, demanding Jonathan give them £100. And as his family cries out for police, there's no response. And this is a great statement here. In the narration, it says, the silence that followed the thieves' alarm vibrated horribly. So silence is silence, right? How does silence vibrate? So Achebe is assigning some qualities here to silence to show how deafening the silence is. You cry out for help, you hear nothing back. That's a powerful silence, a tragic silence. And so the silence is loud and terrible because no one is responding to their cries. And this shows that people are very self-focused after the war. So Jonathan's kind of the exception in his nobility. Many people are self-focused. And again, this shows the after effects of colonization via the after effects of the war. Now you have a statement from the thieves. I'm going to do my best to read it, but I'm probably not going to do well. All righto, now make we talk business. We no be bad thief. We no like for make trouble. Trouble done finish, war done finish, and all the kata kata way D for inside. No civil war again. This time nah civil peace. No, be so? So a lot of this dialogue here is what we call Nigerian Pidgin, or Nigerian dialect, and Achebe is interweaving it with English. So he's not writing his story in Nigerian, which is kind of where the argument Rushdie makes in the essays we just look at comes from. Rushdie's arguing in part in defense of the decision not to write in Indian, or in this case for Achebe not to write in Nigerian, but to write in English. It's more powerful to remake English in their shape. More people throughout the world will read their works. That's part of Rushdie's argument, but they're also able, as I said, to challenge the assumptions of the language, to retest their ability to recolonize, reshape the language, and then have many Western readers read it that way is quite powerful. And so by interweaving Nigerian with English here, Achebe's doing that, and you can see the effect. One thing I noticed now was reading it out loud. It's easier to understand than just reading it in the textbook, not out loud. And so that right there demonstrates some of its effect. Um, there's also the title of the story comes into place here. Achebe uses irony by juxtaposing civil war and civil peace. So civil war is fighting amongst each other, right? So the idea of civil peace would be peace amongst each other, but it's not actually peaceful, right? The robbers are using the rhetoric of saying, just give us the money and we won't hurt you, and then everything stays peaceful. He's saying, don't start another civil war by resisting. Um, but they're really just extorting this man. And so this is emblematic of turmoil that's often part of decolonization. You have um, people from the former colony are inflicting violence and abuse on each other, trying to take advantage of each other so that they can just survive because the conditions were often so horrible after decolonization. What eventually happens is Jonathan gives them the 30 pounds he does have, and the leader's actually amenable to this. The other guys want more, but he convinces them this is enough. He believes Jonathan's being truthful about how much he has, and the thieves leave. And the egg rasher, the 30 pounds, people in the community are very disappointed he had to give that up. And he's saying, no, my family's still alive. All I had to give up was this 30 pounds. I can make more money. My family is still alive. These people had machine guns. They were going to kill my family, but they didn't. That's a blessing. That means nothing puzzles God. I count it as nothing, he told his sympathizers, his eyes on the rope he was tying. What is egg rasher? Did I depend on it last week? Or is it greater than other things that went with the war? I say, let egg rasher perish in the flames. Let it go where everything else is gone. Nothing puzzles God. Jonathan's faith transcends his circumstances. So he could say, I can't believe I lost this money. My family needs that. I was going to do so much with it. But instead, he says, nothing puzzles God. So his faith in God's larger vision helps him transcend these circumstances and see, like he says, did he depend on it last week? Is it as important as his son who died in the war? No. So he lost more than, I can't remember if it was 20 or 30 pounds. He lost a lot more than that in the war. He lost his son in the war. This is not as important as that. The rest of his family's still alive, and that's such a blessing. And they could have died again. They were again threatened last night. So he's holding on to that blessing. His family is much more important than the money. And so what you see as a character at the start of the story who after the war is optimistic and grateful. And I think gratitude is the most important part of the story. And then an incident that's emblematic of the effects of decolonization where their lives are threatened again. And as they come out of that unscathed, less money, but unscathed, again, Jonathan, you see him live through a circumstance and remain optimistic and most importantly, grateful. You see him grateful again at the end of the story. That really drives home what Achebe is trying to say. He shows the horrible, deplorable conditions of decolonization, makes that real for Western readers, and then gives them a complex character who's able to endure through those circumstances and even still believe in something greater than himself. Um, so, what are some of the things we learned here? Achebe himself used the phrase far below the eye level to describe some of his characters, and so Jonathan Awigbo is an extraordinarily ordinary character. He's an everyman. He's not a superhero. He's not a great king. Um, but it helped him achieve these types of characters helped Achebe achieve his lifelong ambition of reversing the dehumanizing preconceptions long affixed to Africans. So by giving us a complex, well-rounded, heroic but in an everyday way protagonist like Jonathan Igbobo, we're able to counteract the stereotypes about Africans, the negative perceptions put out there by English and European writers. We're able to see a more complex, more well-rounded, more noble character, an optimistic, hopeful, grateful character. In other words, Achebe's depiction of Jonathan and other characters like him is a complex, nuanced individual, challenges the one-dimensional, dehumanizing stereotypes and assumptions about Africans. So when you depict someone in one way, in a whether positive or negative, one way. That's dehumanizing. You're denying their role as a complex, nuanced human. Achebe brings that back. He makes Africans complex, nuanced humans again through characters like Jonathan Igbobo and through Okonkwo when things fall apart. For centuries, really until the advent of post-colonial writing, Westerners primarily relied on accounts of the East written by other Westerners to inform their perceptions of the East. These accounts often depict, should say, the East in a monolithic way. And so this is the bullet point I should have had as like the first bullet point in this lesson, and I said it out loud earlier on. You had Eastern or Western writers being the ones who depicted um, Africa, Asia, Caribbean, being very general here because there were so many countries and cultures colonized by the British. And they often depicted those countries in a monolithic way. That means mono meaning one. No nuance, no diversity. And that's a dehumanizing depiction. So you have the power of literature. The power of literature for hundreds of years of colonization before post colonial literature depicting the East, depicting the colonized countries and peoples and cultures in a monolithic way. Then you have post-colonial literature challenging that by not going monolithic, by going nuanced, by showing the complexities, the intricacies. Finally, I'll end with this statement. Jonathan is an everyman, but also a hero, because his experiences in the war have made him someone who greatly values human life. He values the lives of his children, of his wife. He values his belief in a God that's greater than himself, and that helps him transcend his circumstances. And so he's saddened for the loss of his son in the war, but that's not going to stop him from believing in things greater than himself or being grateful for the family he does have. And this is the kind of character we need, all of us need, following colonization.